The year was 1877, and the wind across the high plains of Wyoming Territory carried a bite that spoke of an early, unforgiving winter. For Caleb Hale, the wind was just another hardship, a constant companion to the ache in his back and the deeper, colder ache in his heart. His small ranch, nestled in a lonely fold of land miles from the nearest tentative settlement of Redemption, was a testament to stubbornness more than prosperity. Each fence post was a victory, each head of cattle a minor miracle wrested from the unforgiving soil and the threat of predators, both four-legged and two. Caleb's world had shrunk considerably 3 years prior, collapsing into the tight confines of grief when his wife, Martha, had succumbed to a fever that swept through their small cabin like a prairie fire, leaving behind only smoke and sorrow. Now his world consisted of the endless cycle of chores, the vast, indifferent sky, and the small, often silent presence of his 6-year-old daughter, Abigail. Abigail, with her mother's wide, solemn eyes and a quietness that sometimes felt like a reproach, was the fragile center of Caleb's fractured existence. He loved her with a fierceness that startled him, a love sharpened by the constant fear of failing her, of not being enough. Their cabin was rudimentary, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and hope. Inside, the air often hung thick with unspoken words, with the memories of Martha's laughter and the scent of the bread she used to bake. Caleb did his best. He mended Abigail's worn dresses with clumsy fingers, braided her fine, brown hair into lopsided plaits, and told her stories by the firelight, stories his own father had told him, tales of courage and endurance that felt hollow on his own tongue. He saw the loneliness in Abigail's gaze, the way she clutched the faded calico doll Martha had made her, its button eyes staring blankly ahead, a mirror to the emptiness in their lives. He saw it because he felt it too, a chasm that no amount of hard work could fill. His life was a routine of resilience, a stoic march through days that were functionally identical. Rise before dawn, tend the stock, mend what was broken, prepare meager meals, check on Abigail, and fall into an exhausted sleep, only to repeat the pattern. There was a profound isolation to their existence, not just geographical, but emotional, a fortress built of loss where Caleb stood guard, his heart shuddered against further pain. The storm came on with a sudden, brutal fury, a maelstrom of sleet and wind that screamed down from the mountains like a banshee. It hit in late afternoon, turning the already fading light into an early, roiling twilight. Caleb had been checking the fences along the creek, a good mile from the cabin, when the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. He'd raced back, the wind tearing at his hat and coat, his breath misting and freezing on his beard. He'd found Abigail huddled by the hearth, her small face pale, the fire struggling against the drafts that snaked through the cabin walls. For 2 days, the world outside was a white, howling chaos. They were trapped, the cabin groaning under the assault. Caleb kept the fire roaring, venturing out only briefly to check on the animals in the lean-to, a perilous journey each time. The snow piled in monstrous drifts, erasing landmarks, transforming their familiar surroundings into an alien landscape. Abigail, usually quiet, clung to him more than usual, her small hand often seeking his. In those moments, the weight of his responsibility felt crushing. If the roof caved, if the food ran out, if one of them fell ill, these thoughts were wolves at the door of his mind. When the storm finally broke on the 3rd morning, it left behind a world transformed, pristine, and perilous. The sun, when it finally appeared, glittered on a landscape of sculpted snow, breathtaking in its beauty, deadly in its implications. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of melting snow from the eaves and the occasional mournful call of a distant bird. Caleb knew he had to check the wider property, assess the damage, ensure the cattle hadn't strayed too far or fallen victim to the elements or predators drawn by the storm. He bundled Abigail warmly, leaving her with a stern warning to stay inside and keep the fire fed. "I won't be long, Pumpkin," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He strapped on his snowshoes, crude, homemade contraptions, and took his rifle, more for potential animal threats than any other. The going was arduous. The snow lay deep and soft in places, crusted and treacherous in others. The creek, which usually meandered gently, was now a swollen, churning torrent where the banks had been overwhelmed, choked with ice and debris. It was near the most ravaged section of the creek, where a copse of cottonwoods had been brutalized by the wind and ice, that he saw it, a splash of dark color against the blinding white, a crumpled shape half buried in a drift near a fallen tree. His first thought was a deer, or perhaps one of his own stray calves, but as he drew closer, his heart began to pound a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. It was not an animal. It was a person, small and still, clad in buckskins, native, a woman. He approached cautiously, his rifle held ready, though not aimed. His mind, already burdened, raced with a new set of anxieties. Relations with the various tribes were a delicate, often volatile thing. Some bands were peaceful, others pushed to desperation by shrinking lands and broken treaties. To find one here, like this, was unsettling. She lay face down, one arm flung out, the dark braid of her hair partially undone and crusted with ice. There was no visible movement. He knelt, his gloved hand reaching out hesitantly, then with more purpose, to touch her shoulder. He rolled her gently onto her back. Her face was ashen, tinged with blue around the lips. A dark stain bloomed on the snow beneath her temple, and another, larger one, soaked the buckskin on her left thigh. Her eyes were closed, her features delicate despite the harshness of her condition. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck, searching for a pulse. For a terrifying moment, there was nothing. Then, a faint, thready beat, as fragile as a trapped bird. She was alive. Barely. Caleb's mind was a whirl. Leave her? The thought was a cold stone in his gut. He couldn't. Not like this. Whatever the risks, whatever the implications, he couldn't leave another human being to die in the snow. Martha's face, pale and still in his memory, flashed before him. He made his decision in that instant, a choice born of a deep-seated humanity he hadn't realized, still flickered so strongly within him. He carefully scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, yet a dead weight. The journey back to the cabin was a brutal, lung-searing effort, each step a testament to his resolve. Abigail, her face pressed to the small, grimy windowpane, saw them coming. Her eyes widened, first with fear, then with a dawning, uncertain curiosity. Inside the relative warmth of the cabin, Caleb laid the woman gently on his own narrow cot, the only spare bed. Abigail hovered nearby, a silent, wide-eyed shadow. "Water, Abigail," Caleb instructed, his voice strained, "and fetch those clean rags from the chest." He began the difficult task of assessing the woman's injuries, his movements careful, almost reverent. The head wound was a nasty gash, already swollen, but it didn't look like the skull was fractured. The leg was worse. A piece of shattered branch, sharp as a spear, had pierced her thigh deeply. It would need cleaning, and that would bring pain. Her breathing was shallow, her skin icy to the touch. Exposure was as much a threat as her wounds. He worked with a focused intensity, drawing on the rudimentary medical knowledge gleaned from frontier life and Martha's own passed-down remedies. He cleaned the head wound with warmed water, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man whose hands were calloused from ropes and tools. Abigail, overcoming her initial apprehension, brought him a bowl of water and the rags, her small face serious. She watched him, her gaze flicking from her father's intent expression to the still, pale face of the stranger. When Caleb began to examine the leg wound, the woman moaned, a low, guttural sound that seemed to tear from the depths of her. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened. Dark, disoriented eyes stared up at him, uncomprehending, then filled with a wild animal fear. She tried to sit up, a choked cry escaping her lips, but Caleb gently pressed her back down. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and calm, though his heart was anything but. "You're safe. You were hurt, in the storm." She didn't understand his words, or if she did, the terror overrode it. She spoke then, a string of rapid melodic syllables in a language he didn't recognize, her voice hoarse and weak. It was Lakota, though he wouldn't know that for some time. Her gaze darted around the small cabin, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings, settling on Abigail, who shrank back slightly. Then her eyes fixed back on Caleb, filled with mistrust and pain. He could see the struggle in them, the instinct to flee warring with the profound weakness of her body. "I won't harm you," Caleb said, looking directly into her eyes, trying to convey sincerity through his tone. He gestured to the wound on her leg. "This needs tending." He held up a clean rag and the bowl of water, then pointed to the injury again, miming cleaning. She watched him, her breathing ragged. The fear didn't leave her eyes, but a flicker of something else, perhaps a desperate understanding, seemed to pass through them. She didn't fight him further as he carefully, painstakingly, cleaned the deep puncture, removing small splinters of wood. He could feel her trembling under his touch, whether from cold, pain, or fear he couldn't tell, probably all three. The next few days passed in a haze of guarded watchfulness and tentative care. Caleb named her Winona in his own mind, a name he'd heard once, belonging to a distant acquaintance's Lakota wife. It seemed to fit her quiet dignity, even in her current state. Winona remained mostly silent, her eyes following Caleb's every move when she was awake. She ate little of the broth he offered, drank water sparingly. Speech between them was non-existent beyond Caleb's simple, often repeated phrases of reassurance and his attempts to gauge her needs through gestures. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her expression, the tightening of her lips when pain flared, the slight widening of her eyes when Abigail came too close. Abigail, after her initial timidity, became fascinated. She would sit on her small stool by the fire, pretending to play with her doll, but her gaze would invariably drift to the woman on the cot. She observed Winona with an intensity that mirrored Caleb's own, though hers was tinged with a childlike curiosity rather than a man's wary concern. Caleb worried about this. He knew the prejudices that festered in redemption. If word got out he was harboring an Indian woman, there would be trouble. Big trouble. But looking at Winona, so vulnerable, so clearly suffering, he couldn't bring himself to consider any other course of action than the one he had taken. He moved her cot closer to the hearth for warmth and rigged a blanket as a crude screen to offer her a measure of privacy, though in the single-room cabin, true privacy was an illusion. He changed the dressing on her leg twice a day. The wound was deep and angry, and he feared infection, the constant scourge of any injury on the frontier. He applied a poultice of comfrey leaves, something Martha had sworn by for drawing out soreness, hoping it would help. Her fever rose and fell, and during the nights when she was restless and mumbling in her own tongue, Caleb would sit by her side, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. A strange sense of protectiveness settling over him. He was tired, bone-tired, juggling his ranch chores, caring for Abigail, and now tending to this unexpected, silent guest. Winona, for her part, endured. The fear in her eyes slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to recede, replaced by a profound weariness and a stoic acceptance of her situation. She watched Caleb with an unblinking intensity, assessing him, he felt, weighing his actions against some internal scale. She saw the way he spoke to Abigail, the rough tenderness in his voice, the way he patiently untangled a knot in the child's hair. She saw the exhaustion etched on his face, the worry lines around his eyes. These small, daily observations were her only language of understanding. One afternoon, about a week after he'd found her, Caleb was attempting to mend a tear in Abigail's only other dress. His large, calloused fingers fumbled with the needle and thread, making a clumsy mess of the task. Abigail watched him with a small, sad smile. From the cot, a soft sound, almost a breath, made him look up. Winona was watching him, a faint, almost indiscernible expression on her face. She gestured weakly with one hand towards the dress, then to herself. Caleb hesitated. Then, slowly, he held out the dress and the needle. Winona's fingers, though still slender and a little shaky, took the items. With slow, deliberate movements, she began to stitch the tear. Her stitches were tiny, even, and incredibly neat. Caleb watched, fascinated. Abigail crept closer, her earlier shyness forgotten, and peered over Winona's shoulder. Winona didn't flinch. She simply continued her work, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she finished, she handed the mended dress to Abigail. The repair was almost invisible. Abigail beamed, a rare, radiant smile that lit up her small face. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the dress. She looked at Winona, then at her father, then back at Winona. It was a small thing, a mended tear, but it felt like a shift in the cabin's tense atmosphere, like the first crack of thaw after a long freeze. Winona still didn't speak English, and Caleb didn't speak Lakota, but in that shared moment, something had passed between them. A thread of connection, as fine and strong as the one Winona had used to mend the dress. As Winona's physical strength slowly returned, the cabin's dynamic began to subtly change. Her leg healed stubbornly, the wound knitting together with excruciating slowness, leaving a puckered, angry scar that Caleb knew would pain her in cold weather for years to come. But the fever finally broke for good, and color began to return to her cheeks. She started to move around the small cabin a little, leaning heavily on a crutch Caleb fashioned for her from a sturdy branch. Her silence remained, but it was no longer the silence of fear or abject weakness. It was a watchful, observant quiet. She began to help in small ways, her movements economical and precise. She would neaten the already tidy cabin, her hands smoothing blankets, arranging the few pots and pans with an innate sense of order. She had a way with the fire, coaxing it to burn brighter with less wood than Caleb used. He'd watch her sometimes, surreptitiously, as she moved about her quiet tasks. There was a grace to her, even with the awkwardness of the crutch, a deep-seated dignity that her tattered buckskins and recent trauma could not diminish. Abigail was the one who truly bridged the chasm of silence and cultural difference. Children, Caleb reflected, had a way of ignoring the barriers adults erected. Abigail, starved for maternal affection and companionship, gravitated towards Winona with an innocent persistence. She would bring Winona wildflowers she'd picked near the creek, their small, bright faces a splash of color in the dim cabin. She'd show Winona her calico doll, chattering away to it, and by extension, to Winona, in a stream of consciousness narrative about her day, her thoughts, her imaginings. Winona would listen, her dark eyes soft as she watched the child. She couldn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, the need for connection in Abigail's voice. One afternoon, Abigail was struggling to weave a chain of dandelions, her small fingers clumsy. Winona, sitting on a low stool by the door, reached out and gently took the flowers. With deft, practiced movements, she wove them into a perfect, delicate circlet, which she then placed carefully on Abigail's head. Abigail gasped with delight, touching the dandelion crown as if it were made of gold. She threw her arms around Winona's neck in a spontaneous hug. Winona stiffened for a moment, then, hesitantly, her hand came up to pat Abigail's back. Caleb, witnessing this from the doorway where he'd been mending a bridle, felt a tightness in his chest he couldn't name. It was an ache, but not entirely of sorrow. Slowly, haltingly, words began to emerge. Winona would point to an object, a cup, a spoon, the fire, and look at Caleb expectantly. He would supply the English word. She would repeat it, her pronunciation careful, sometimes stumbling, then say a word in her own language. "Mni," she said one day, pointing to the water bucket. "Water." Then, touching her chest lightly, "Winona." It was the first time he'd heard her name herself to him. He nodded. "Caleb," he replied, touching his own chest. "Abigail," he said, gesturing to his daughter, who giggled. A small smile, the first genuine smile Caleb had seen from her, touched Winona's lips. It transformed her face, softening the harsh lines of pain and suspicion, revealing a glimpse of the woman beneath. The days settled into a new rhythm. Caleb still worked from dawn till dusk outside, but the cabin he returned to no longer felt quite so empty. The silence was different now, punctuated by Abigail's chatter, by Winona's soft humming as she sometimes did while working, or by the quiet murmur of her voice as she tried to teach Abigail a Lakota word for a bird or a flower. Winona's presence was a quiet balm. She mended their clothes with an artistry Caleb could only marvel at. She showed him ways to use plants he'd previously ignored, certain roots for flavor in their bland stews, leaves for a soothing tea that helped Abigail sleep when she was restless. Her knowledge of the land, even this small piece of it, was profound. One evening, as a chill wind whistled around the eaves, Abigail coughed, a dry, rasping sound that worried Caleb. By morning she was feverish and fretful. Caleb's fear was a cold knot in his stomach, memories of Martha's illness flooding back. He bathed Abigail's forehead, tried to coax her to drink broth, but she was listless. Winona watched, her expression unreadable. Then, she slipped out of the cabin, despite Caleb's questioning look. She was gone for over an hour, returning with a pouch of herbs and roots he didn't recognize. Without a word, she began to prepare a concoction, crushing some herbs, steeping others in hot water. The aroma that filled the cabin was pungent, earthy. Caleb watched, torn between hope and a deep-seated skepticism about Indian medicine, but the desperation to help Abigail overrode his doubts. Winona gently coaxed Abigail to drink the bitter brew, then applied a poultice of mashed leaves to her chest. She sat with Abigail, humming a low, repetitive chant, her hand resting on the child's forehead. For 2 days, Winona nursed Abigail with a quiet, unwavering devotion. Caleb, exhausted and anxious, could only watch, feeling helpless. Slowly, miraculously, Abigail's fever began to subside. Her breathing eased. By the 3rd morning she was sitting up, weak but smiling faintly, asking for water. Caleb looked at Winona, who was tidying away her remedies, her face showing the strain of her vigil. "Thank you," he said, the words thick with emotion. You saved her." Winona met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw not just gratitude or understanding, but a shared humanity, a deep well of compassion in her dark eyes. "Pahasapa, Black Hills," she said softly, touching her chest. "My people, healers." She looked at Abigail, a tender light in her eyes. "Little one, strong." It was a moment of profound connection, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them, forged in shared hardship and unexpected tenderness. He was beginning to see her not just as a survivor or a helper, but as a woman of immense strength and quiet wisdom. The cabin, once a place of stark loneliness, now held a fragile warmth, a nascent sense of belonging that encompassed all 3 of them. He found himself looking forward to returning at the end of the day, to the smell of stew simmering over the fire, often flavored with Winona's foraged additions, and the sight of Abigail sitting close to Winona, listening intently as Winona tried to teach her a simple cat's cradle game with a piece of string. The empty spaces in his heart, while not filled, felt less cavernous. The fragile peace of their unusual household was not destined to last undisturbed. Redemption, the small settlement a half-day's ride away, was a place of rough-hewn buildings and even rougher opinions. Caleb rarely went to town, preferring his solitude, but he needed supplies: flour, salt, ammunition. He'd put off the trip for as long as possible, but their stores were dwindling. He left Winona and Abigail with a sense of unease, his parting instructions to Winona brief but firm: keep out of sight, bolt the door. News, like tumbleweeds, traveled fast on the frontier, even without direct observation. Perhaps a hunter had seen smoke rising too consistently from Caleb's chimney, or noticed an extra set of smaller footprints near the creek after the snows melted further. Maybe it was just the suspicious nature of isolated men. In the dusty confines of the general store, while Caleb was negotiating for a sack of flour, he felt eyes on him. Amos Blackwood, a rancher whose property bordered Caleb's to the east and a self-appointed guardian of the town's dubious morals, approached him. Blackwood was a burly man with a florid face and small, assessing eyes. "Hail," Blackwood began, his voice carrying a tone of false bonhomie. "Haven't seen you in an age. Everything all right out your way? Heard tell the storm hit you folks hard." "We managed," Caleb replied curtly, not inviting further conversation. "Managed, eh?" Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly. "Heard other things too. Strange things. Some of the boys riding patrol for stray cattle thought they saw unusual signs out your way after the big snow." Caleb's gut tightened. "Don't know what you mean, Blackwood. My land is my own concern." "Is it now?" Another man, a lanky fellow named Jasper Donovan, who always seemed to be at Blackwood's elbow, chimed in, a smirk on his face. "Some say you ain't been so alone out there. Some say you took in a souvenir from the storm." The implication was ugly, immediate. Caleb felt a cold anger rise. "I took in someone who was injured and freezing to death. Common decency, Blackwood. Something you might not be familiar with." Blackwood's face darkened. "Decency? Harboring a red-skinned savage, Hale? That ain't decency. That's inviting trouble. For all of us. You know the tensions. There's been talk of Lakota war parties further north. What if she's a spy? Or diseased?" His voice grew louder, drawing the attention of other patrons in the store. "This town won't stand for it, Hale. You need to get rid of her. Send her back where she came from, or we will." The threat hung heavy in the air. Caleb clenched his fists, the urge to strike Blackwood almost overwhelming. But he knew violence would only escalate things, endanger Winona and Abigail more. She's a woman, recovering from severe injuries. She's no threat to anyone. That's for us to judge, Blackwood stated, his stance aggressive. You got till the end of the week, Hale. Rid yourself of the problem. Or we'll come out and do it for you. He turned and stalked out of the store, Donovan and a few other grim-faced men following him. Caleb finished his purchases in a haze of fury and dread. The ride back to the ranch was fraught with anxiety. How could he protect them? The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt terribly vulnerable. He explained the situation to Winona, his English simple and direct, supplemented by gestures. She listened, her face impassive, but he saw the understanding, and a flicker of old fear returned to her eyes. I go, she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the floor. No trouble for you, for Abigail. No, Caleb said, his voice firm, surprising himself with its conviction. This is your home now if you want it. We don't run. He looked at her, truly looked at her. Her quiet strength, her kindness to Abigail, the way she had subtly woven herself into the fabric of their lives. The thought of her leaving, of returning to that stark emptiness, was unbearable. And the injustice of Blackwood's prejudice stoked a righteous anger in him. Abigail, sensing the tension, came and stood beside Winona, slipping her small hand into the woman's. Don't go, Winona, she pleaded, her voice trembling. Please. Winona looked down at the child, her expression softening. She gently squeezed Abigail's hand. Her gaze met Caleb's, a silent question in her eyes. He nodded, a grim resolve settling on his features. They would face this together. The week passed under a cloud of grim anticipation. Caleb kept his rifle close, his senses on high alert. He reinforced the cabin door, checked the hinges on the shutters. Winona, despite her quiet demeanor, seemed to draw herself up, a resilience hardening her features. She spoke little of the impending threat, but her hands were rarely still, mending, cooking, tending to Abigail, as if normalcy itself were a shield. She taught Abigail how to make small figures from river clay, their heads bent together in quiet concentration, a fragile island of peace in a sea of anxiety. On the fifth day, late in the afternoon, they came. Caleb spotted the dust cloud first, a telltale sign on the horizon. 5 riders, led by Amos Blackwood, with Jasper Donovan smirking beside him. They reined in a short distance from the cabin, their demeanor arrogant and menacing. Caleb stepped out onto the small porch, his shotgun held loosely but ready at his side. Abigail, white-faced, peeked from behind the doorframe. Winona stood just inside, out of direct sight, but Caleb could feel her presence, a silent strength at his back. Hale, Blackwood called out, his voice sharp. Time's up, we've come for the squaw. The word was a deliberate insult, ugly and demeaning. Her name is Winona, Caleb said, his voice level, though his heart hammered. And she's under my protection. She's committed no crime, threatened no one. You have no business here. Our business is protecting this community, Blackwood retorted, his hand resting on the butt of the pistol at his hip, and that means removing any threat. Savages bring trouble, disease, and draw others of their kind. She goes, one way or another. She was dying when I found her, Caleb stated, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. Abandoned after the storm, I did what any decent man would do. What I hope any man would do if it were my daughter out there, alone and hurt. He glanced back at Abigail, whose small face was filled with fear. Decency don't extend to her kind, Donovan sneered. Now, are you going to hand her over, or do we have to come in and get her? He made a move to dismount. Stay where you are, Donovan, Caleb warned, his grip tightening on the shotgun. This is my property. You're trespassing, and you're making threats. Just then, the cabin door opened a little wider. Winona stepped out, not fully onto the porch but visible. She wasn't cowering. She stood tall, her gaze direct, meeting Blackwood's hostile stare without flinching. Her dark braids were neat, her borrowed dress clean. There was a quiet dignity about her that even the coarse men before them couldn't entirely ignore. Abigail, seeing Winona step forward, darted out from behind Caleb and ran to Winona's side, clutching her hand tightly, defiantly. Leave her alone. Abigail cried out, her small voice surprisingly strong. She's good. She takes care of me. She's my friend. The sight of the small, blonde child so fiercely protecting the native woman gave the men pause. It was an image that didn't fit their prejudiced narrative. Blackwood looked momentarily disconcerted. Winona squeezed Abigail's hand, then looked at Caleb. She spoke, her English still accented but clear and steady. "I bring no harm, I wish only peace." Her eyes swept over the riders. "My people suffered in the storm. I was lost. This man, Caleb, he saved my life. His child, she is good." Her simple words, her calm demeanor, and Abigail's passionate defense seemed to shift something in the tense standoff. One of the riders, a younger man Caleb didn't recognize, shifted uneasily in his saddle, looking away from Blackwood. Blackwood, however, was not so easily swayed. His face hardened again. "Words are cheap. We came here to do a job." He started to swing his leg over his horse. "Amos," a gruff voice called from the back of the group. It was an older rancher, Nathaniel Shaw, a man known for his taciturn nature but generally fair mind. He hadn't spoken until now. "Hold on a minute." Shaw urged his horse forward slightly. "The child speaks true by the looks of it, and the woman, she don't look like no threat. Hale's always been a straight shooter. If he says he found her hurt, I believe him." Blackwood glared at Shaw. "You siding with him, Shaw? With a savage lover?" Shaw's weathered face didn't change expression. "I'm siding with common sense, Amos, and maybe a bit of Christian charity, which seems to be in short supply around here today. We ride out here, threatening a man on his own land, scaring his child, over what? Fear and rumor? Let it be. If she causes trouble later, we deal with it then. But for now, this ain't right." Another rider mumbled his agreement. The united front Blackwood had expected was crumbling. Donovan looked uncertain. Caleb kept his shotgun steady, his gaze fixed on Blackwood. The air crackled with unresolved tension. Blackwood looked from Caleb to Winona, to Abigail clinging to her, then to the dissenting faces among his own men. He was a bully, Caleb realized, who relied on intimidation and a unified pack. When faced with principled opposition and division in his own ranks, his bluster began to fade. With an angry curse, Blackwood pulled his leg back over his horse. "This ain't over, Hale," he snarled, his face contorted with frustrated rage. "You mark my words. You'll regret this." He wheeled his horse around violently and galloped away, Donovan and one other staunch loyalist following. Shaw and the remaining rider lingered for a moment. Shaw nodded curtly to Caleb. "You do what you think is right, Hale. Seems you are." He then turned his horse and rode off at a more measured pace, the other man following. The dust settled slowly in the afternoon sun. Silence descended, profound and heavy, broken only by Abigail's shaky sigh of relief as she buried her face in Winona's side. Caleb slowly lowered the shotgun, his arm aching from the tension. He let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He looked at Winona. Her eyes met his, and in their depths he saw gratitude, relief, and something more, a shared understanding, a partnership forged in the face of adversity. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse, "for now at least." Winona nodded, her hand stroking Abigail's hair. "You are a good man, Caleb Hale." The words, simple and heartfelt, resonated deep within him. He wasn't sure about being a good man, but he knew he had done the right thing. And in doing so, he had protected not just Winona, but the fragile, burgeoning sense of home they had begun to build together. In the weeks and months that followed, a new equilibrium settled over the small ranch. The threat from Blackwood and his ilk didn't vanish entirely. There were still cold stares if Caleb had to go to redemption, muttered comments he chose to ignore. But Nathaniel Shaw's quiet support had shifted public opinion enough that open aggression seemed unlikely. The incident had, in an unexpected way, solidified their unconventional family. They had faced a common enemy and stood together. Winona, no longer just a guest or a patient, became an integral part of their lives. The unspoken question of her departure faded into the background, replaced by the quiet rhythms of shared existence. She taught Caleb more about the land than he'd learned in all his years of toiling on it, which plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, how to read the subtle signs of changing weather. Her skills were invaluable, making their hard life a little less precarious. She fashioned snares that brought fresh meat to their table, mended their worn boots with sinew and skill, and even showed Caleb how to better track game. But it was with Abigail that Winona's true gift lay. She possessed a deep intuitive understanding of the child. She listened to Abigail's stories with a patience Caleb often lacked. She taught her songs in Lakota, melodies that were both haunting and beautiful. She showed her how to bead intricate patterns onto scraps of leather, how to identify different bird calls, how to find wild berries without picking the poisonous ones. Abigail blossomed under Winona's gentle tutelage, her earlier solemnity giving way to a brighter, more confident demeanor. The laughter that had been so rare in the cabin became a more frequent sound. She would run to Winona with her small triumphs and hurts, finding comfort and understanding in the woman's quiet presence. Winona was, in every way that mattered, the mother Abigail had lost and so desperately missed. She didn't try to replace Martha, that was impossible. Instead, she filled a different space, bringing her own unique warmth and wisdom. Caleb watched this transformation with a quiet sense of wonder and profound gratitude. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long began to recede, like a stubborn winter finally giving way to spring. He found himself talking more, sharing his thoughts and worries with Winona during the quiet evenings after Abigail was asleep. Their conversations were often halting, a mixture of her slowly improving English and his attempts to understand her perspective, but a deep understanding grew between them. Rooted in mutual respect and shared experience, he learned snippets of her past, the loss of her own family to sickness and conflict, her separation from her band during the chaos of that terrible storm. Her grief mirrored his own, creating another unspoken bond. The harshness of the land remained, the work was still unending, but it no longer felt like a solitary struggle against an indifferent world. There was a purpose now that extended beyond mere survival. There was companionship, shared burdens, and even moments of quiet joy. One evening, as the sky outside bruised into a soft twilight, Caleb sat on the porch, watching Winona teach Abigail how to form a star shape with a loop of string between her fingers. Abigail's brow was furrowed in concentration, her tongue peeking out from the corner of her mouth. Winona's expression was gentle, her hands guiding Abigail's. A sense of peace, deep and resonant, settled over Caleb. This small, unconventional family, forged in a storm and tested by prejudice, was his. This was home. The future was still uncertain, the prairie vast and often unforgiving. But for the first time in a long, long while, Caleb Hale looked towards it not with resignation, but with a quiet, resilient hope. The wind still whispered across the plains, but now it seemed to carry not just hardship, but the faint, promising melody of a new song.